A very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is an In Conversation event that involves two colleagues, Laura Swift and Fiona Macintosh, in conversation with our guest, Alexander Zeldin. It's a great honor to have Alexander back in Oxford, right? Alexander is a writer and director of both theatre and film. He has worked extensively across Europe and beyond. He's currently visiting fellow with the cultural program of the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. And this event, I don't know if it was timed to coincide with that, but it certainly coincides with the other plays, a new adaptation of Antigone, which is currently playing at the National Theatre. We thought that the time is right to get him to talk to us about what he has done with this particular play, how he has looked at Sophocles' Antigone, and what the experience of this production has been like for him. So a very warm welcome to Alexander, and without further ado, I will let hand over to Laura and Fiona.
So, Alexander, I wondered if we could start with a broad question and ask you to tell us a bit about what brought you to this project, why something inspired by Antigone, and why now? How does that fit with what you feel theatre should be doing?
Yeah, great question. Hi, everyone. So, can I just quickly ask, are you all classicists, or some of you like theatre folk? Who's theatre person? Just like yourselves. Okay, cool. Good. Who's seen the play? Quite a few. Wicked. Okay, so some of you want to learn about what I think about classics and stuff like that, and some of you want to talk about theatre, and we can try and blend the two. Cool. Right. So why a tragedy? I think for me personally, I'll speak very personally. If anyone else speak, I think that the question is quite vast and quite beautiful. I did a workshop. There's a kind of practical answer and a more kind of found on, so I'll start with the practical. I did a workshop, an international directors workshop at the National Theatre, where I am still an associate for a few more months. And we organised a thing where we invited directors from around the world to come to work on an idea where they would each have their own approach to it. And we would all watch each other work, and there would be a group of young theatre makers who would watch this process unfold. And the theme we chose was Antigone. And so I just devised for the week. I didn't really write anything. I just improvised with some actors, chaotic and kind of cool. And I didn't have any. I think it's very important when you make theatre that you mix. You mix what you're totally ignorant about and what you sort of know a lot about. And so I didn't know very much. I just read the play and then literally said, "Oh, what does that mean to you?" And then I started making something. So deliberately being sort of silly. And for some reason, the National Theatre were like, "Oh, can we do this?" And it was a bit of a surprise, so I said, okay, not sure. So I needed to find a real reason for it. And what I was left with from Antigone was, I guess, three main ideas. Well, the first was, what is a tragedy today in theatre? Why do we need to do a tragedy? What is it that I can get from going to this ancient form? And I guess the second question was, I need an actor that can really embody this. And an actor that can inspire me to work on this kind of mythical, archetypical figure of Antigone, who it seems to me is really interested in the question of authority. So I needed an actor, a person, a human being, that would respond to this in a very profound way. And I found that person in Emma Darcy, who is an extraordinary artist and actor, who some of you will know if you watch this House of Dragons thing, but I knew because they were somebody that I wanted to work with for a long time. And I guess the third thing was what is the essential question that I want to ask and answer? I don't think artists should answer questions, by the way. So I don't have any answers if you've got questions. But instead, I think you should make a question live. You should give flesh to a question. You should do something that allows it to vibrate in the air. And the question that attracted me to this play was really a question that I found more broadly applied to Sophocles. And that was, what do you do in the face of the suffering of others? And I think that's a very contemporary question, because we're all aware of suffering everywhere. And how do we interact with that? How do we live in a relationship to another person's suffering? And I guess then the question you asked about, like, why now, and what's theatre, what's tragedy? Well, I found it a really interesting challenge to try and write a tragedy today. And I had some really clear rules for myself. I mean, I don't know how many of you know anything about my work, or if you've seen other runs of my plays, but I did a trilogy called The Inequalities that was really hardcore, basically, and it was set in, it was a kind of the austerity trilogy, so it was about like social violence in the last 10 years, which has been quite a big theme and a big idea of the governments. And then I did a play called The Confessions that was my mother's life from birth till death. So I've always been quite interested in intimate stories about intimate life against the backdrop of social violence, I suppose. And so coming to this play, I thought, well, I'm going to have to try and do something completely different. And I set myself some very clear rules. The first would be, it would be one time in one place, or one time as much as possible, but one location. And I would try and think about certain structural rules around the play that I would try and use in my writing. And the last thing I'll say is, I think theatre is there to disturb you. I like to disturb. I think that the Greek, what I got from my perspective as approaching the Greek material for the first time was, I wanted to feel a little bit that I was going into taboo, transgression. And the model felt to me exciting to say things that are unsayable. And that was my starting point. So quite a few starting points.
So there are a reasonable number of people who haven't seen the play and
so
maybe don't know that much about it. So maybe it would be helpful if you could talk through, I suppose, the play and the characters and the similarities and dissimilarities with the original Antigone myth.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, disclaimer, it's quite dissimilar to Antigone, so apologies. Might be useful to like launch this sort of slideshow of images.
Put the lights
down.
Yeah.
So, should I just tell you the story? Is that the best way of doing this? And then those of you that have seen it, you can go, that's not what happens. I'll just tell you the story of the play, and then you can work out how it links and how it doesn't, and we can talk about that if that's interesting to you. Once upon a time, there was a man called Adam who had a brother called Chris, who's played by Tobias Menzies. That's Emma, that's Antigone, Annie. That's Tiresias, Jerry, Tezza. Where is he? The next one. That's Ismene, Izzy. This might be useful actually to do this. That's same people. That's Chris. That's Creon. Okay, now I'll talk about the play. And then in a minute you'll see, look, very intense. And that's a pretty important scene. Oh, there you are. That's Erica Eurydice. Okay, that's the end of the play. All right, so I'll talk about the whole play. So there's a man called Adam who has a wife who dies in an accident. He has two daughters, Izzy and Annie, and he's left alone with them, but his behavior is increasingly erratic and he's suffering from severe mental health problems. He has alienated his brother, Chris. He doesn't want to speak to his brother. And he is, by all accounts, someone that's controlling and complex and difficult. He is left alone with these two daughters, and one day, he brings his brother, Chris, to come and live in the house, to look after him, because he knows something is going to happen to him. And lo and behold, he takes his own life and dies by suicide, hanging himself in one of the trees to the back of this property that was incidentally his own father's property. So that's the kind of initial event, 10 years before the events of our play. So in this moment of chaos, of grief, of absolute boundaryless chaos, Chris moves into the house. And Chris, remember, doesn't really know his nieces. At this point, Annie is 16 and Izzy is 14. And Annie and Chris become too close. And Annie herself was very close to Adam. And she becomes intermingled with him. in some way. It's unclear what exactly. And at some point, Chris sends her away to boarding school. And there's a kind of estrangement between Chris and Annie. But Annie takes her father's death very, very badly and refuses for these ashes that are contained in an urn to be buried, to be scattered. She doesn't want to scatter the ashes because she doesn't want to say he's dead, he's gone. So the play takes place 10 years later when Chris has now met a new woman who has a child, Lenny, played by Lee Braithwaite somewhere up there, younger person, about your age, and a bit younger, 17. And they and their mother move in with Chris to this house that was the house of the brother that had been left sort of in disrepair, and they do a big Grand Designs right move number on it. So they massively renovate the whole house and try and put a big glass window out, and they have a plan to cut down the forest at the back. So in essence, the kind of last act of this new start is to finally scatter these ashes, which have been left in the cellar for 10 years. And so they reach out to Annie, who's been completely estranged and meanwhile is living in a kind of outsider life. So we don't know too much about it, apart from she's been in and out of psychiatric facilities, but crucially, she's somebody that is, I never really spell this out, but she's somebody that is living, I guess, countercurrent to the system. She has beliefs that actually I share, but like just beliefs that probably a lot of you share. But already in that position, she is against a kind of authority that is embodied by this patriarchal uncle. So as you can see, there's no big state, there's no police force, there's no army. But there's my approach was to say, I'm going to tell a big epic tragedy inside a family. So what if the roles of the state were put inside the four walls of a family? That's where we started from. How does power exist inside a family? How does coercion, power, memory, grief, how do all these things blow up someone's life inside a family? Well, it's pretty obvious. So now for the events of the play, very briefly. So Annie shows up, having finally answered an email after 9 months of Chris trying, shows up with her backpack on the day of the scattering of these ashes and says, no, I don't want you to scatter the ashes. And Chris, one would expect Chris to say, well, I insist that we do. I'm sorry, that's what I want to do, but I respect you or whatever. So he tries, first of all, he gets a doggy bag and empties a third of the ashes and says, there you go, now please leave. By the way, it's a comedy, huh? And Annie refuses to leave. She said, I don't want us to partition Dad. So she puts the ashes, she forces the ashes back into the urn. Chris says, I'm going to go on my own. Erica says, you're being crazy. What are you doing? Why are you acting like this? But he still goes. And he takes Lenny with him. But before he leaves, Erica calls him upstairs and Annie empties all the ashes, so steals all the ashes into a doggy bag and puts them in her pants to hide them. So she puts her dead dad in her underwear. Chris goes to this event, a bit like this one, where I'm meant to do the scattering of the ashes and learn, oh, sorry, they aren't there. A bit embarrassing. So Chris, take this point, Chris, a man, is humiliated. That's not very good for certain kind of men. So he comes back to the house and he wants to find out where the ashes are. He confronts Annie. Annie, meanwhile, has changed into her father's clothes. I'm reading a synopsis because some of you haven't seen it, okay? And he absolutely shockingly lunges at her and tries to pull her trousers down to get to these ashes. And he says, get out of my house. Meanwhile, the ashes are given back to him by Lenny, who, to stop this act of violence, says, look, they're upstairs. Annie then puts a tent up in the garden, which really freaks Chris out. And it's revealed that at the moment of the death, 10 years ago, Annie and Chris went outside holding this urn and spoke to the dead in the garden, in the trees. She was so upset, she went out and slept in the tent with Chris, where they both pretended to be the dead person and somehow communed in this very strange, very intimate setting of this blue tent. And Annie is still in that moment. So in a way, you have two different forms of grief. You have somebody that wants to eradicate the past and start again, and is doing it on the site of the violence. And you have another person who wants to rebuild the city, if you will. And on the other side, you've got someone that wants to stay in the old law, the world of hanging on to grief. And Annie's motivation, for those of you that want to be actors, is, by the way, I don't recommend that way of thinking about acting, but we can get to that. And Annie wants to get into the center of the epicenter of her own grief. She wants to lean into the pain of this. And what's revealed is that in this intermingling between Annie and Chris 10 years ago, a terrible, terrifying, boundary-breaking, taboo attraction occurred. Now, I leave it ambiguous in the play if there was any act of, let's call it what it is, abuse or sexual contact between them. I leave it very ambiguous. In my mind, there wasn't. However, in the course of the play, Chris comes back. I'm jumping ahead because we'll be here all day. Chris comes back and puts a tea towel on his head and says to Annie, the day when you were there was the only time in my life I felt alive. And they kiss. They're caught by Erica. So suddenly, the known person becomes the unknown person. And it seems to me that in tragedy, what's very important is that you end up knowing yourself, who you truly are. Arthur Miller said this wonderfully about Eddie Carbone, that he ends the play with him shouting, "My name, give me my name." He wants to know who he is, to truly see oneself. When Phaedra in Racine says, "J'aime," exclamation mark, he breaks the Alexandrian and he puts it right in the middle. Why? Because suddenly what's spoken is not impossible to unspeak. And I have him wearing a mask, which is a tea towel in my version, because he's so ashamed of this desire. It's love in the wrong place, desire in the wrong place. And it links to death, which for me in Antigone, now I read several versions of Antigone. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to read the Greek. I was able to read Hilda, who I think is a remarkable poet. And I read him in David Constantine, I'm sorry, who's an amazing poet himself and a big inspiration to me, even though I can't remember his name, who that language made me feel like there was some relationship, some taboo-breaking, transgressive relationship between sexuality and death that felt absolutely rooted in what I needed to bring to the surface if I was going to write about Antigone. So I was interested in somebody who was dead already, that's another line in the play, and who wants to commune, in the case of Sophocles, with the brother. In my case, it's with the father, who looks like the uncle. And so I went down the path of sexuality and incest very accidentally. But my big guide was a line at the end of the Tibaid by Racine, which was around Creon declaring love for Antigone. So fundamentally, this is a play about grief and justice. And I can speak now very personally for 10 seconds and I'll shut up. Why did I talk about ashes? Because in my own personal life, and for those of you who've seen my other plays, you'll know this, or read them, I'm very interested in ashes because in my own life, my father died when I was 15, not of suicide, but his ashes are still in my family home. And this refusal to, without getting into too much personal detail, it's completely irrelevant, this commonly held belief that the dead aren't really dead, but if we keep them close, they won't ever leave us. We don't have ways of mourning, I feel. That's my personal experience. Mourning is very difficult. And one of the functions of theatre is, in my opinion, if you look at all theatrical cultures from Asia, from Africa, as much as it is from Europe, there's a relationship between the dead and the living that is boundaryless. And this world of the living, the world of the dead, this is one of the roots of theatre. And so for me, in my own personal experience, my own father being a very present person in my life, even though he's dead, sometimes the dead can be more alive than the living. I know this from experience. I'm sure all of you do in your own families. And in the case of Antigone, the dead are more alive than the living. In fact, she wants to be with the dead. The tent is also the tomb. We can get into all this. Basically, I really did do Antigone, except to be really honest with you, the only way to do Antigone was to completely portray it, to really get to the heart of it. And so I'll end by just saying that the greatest injustice for some people is death. And that deeply resonates with me, and I feel like deeply resonates with Sophocles. The chaos and incomprehension of death. I guess I gave you a pretty good summary there, or something like a good summary. If not good, it was lengthy. So maybe you can, do you want to see the set? I'm trying to kind of cater for those who haven't seen it. There's a little bit of an image of the set that we could look at. But we don't have sound, so I'll just give a live commentary. Can you even see that? The set design, not so they got subtitled, it's like French film. Can you see that? You can speak up.
Yeah.
This has to be a bit more interactive. So it's a between worlds. It's a building site. It's between the new and so it's the old house, traces of the old house. And then there was this light box that moved above it. Very expensive. Don't try that in the Taylor. Then the tent that's like a tomb. You know, it's shaped a bit like a tomb in my mind. So if I was more erudite, I could explain how this all links to antiquity, but I think it sort of somehow resonates with what I felt in these plays. So you see, you go to the globe, there's paintings of the clouds above, there's a trapdoor below, and in Korean theatre and no theatre, and in fact in medieval theatre, there's where you are on the stage represents where you are in the cosmos, to simplify. I've always been very convinced of that, and that's why I've always been interested in having something vertical, something in the horizontal, the sort of real life plane, and something below. Korean theatre, for instance, when you speak low in the voice, you're speaking to the underworld, the middle tone, you're speaking to the and the high tone you're speaking to the world above. So yeah, so that's some of that. I hope that was okay.
Yeah.
It's a bit meandering, but I didn't rehearse it.
Well, thank you. That was extraordinary, and I felt, even though you told us, of course, the backstory before you told us what unravelled during the course of the play proper. And it's that unravelling that particularly interests me, because we discussed this over lunch, but I think enough people in the room who've seen it will know that the way your play and your production, and that's in itself very interesting, and maybe let's talk about that, the way it unravels made the audience on the night I was there absolutely audibly gasp. Yeah, the pace is extraordinary, and I suppose it's how you constructed this play that interests me. And in some ways, I mean, you talked at the very beginning about the rules that you set yourself. And in some ways, I'd like to ask and even suggest perhaps that actually Greek tragedy isn't there, although it obviously is in there in terms of content. But I'm wondering whether it's not French classical tragedy, and particularly the kind of interwar French ideas about how tragedy works, the idea that it's a kind of bound up kind of spring, and that I honestly, and this is all credit to you and your production, I had never felt that quite so much in the theatre myself. So I'm really interested in how and when this remarkable art actually was crafted. Is this the process that you're devising? Is that what you're aiming for? And is that product ultimately something that comes from, kind of French neoclassical tragedy, or where does it come from?
Well, it's a great question. I'll do my best to answer it. I'm sure you know this from your other experiences in this. Maybe I'm an exception, but in a way, the thing that you wish to say the most articulately, you say it in the way you make the theatre, not when you describe the theatre. So there's no better remedy than to go and watch it. But I think, yes, look, I may be wrong, but I think that one thing that's really been very important to me in my life is knowing that théâtron means place for seeing. And so I've always felt that in my early productions, partly because I had no money, and I've reproduced this at enormous expense since. When I started making theatre, I only was working in like community centres and stuff like that. So there was no lighting. So the audience and the actors were one. And this was very important to me because it was about how much effort you're going to put to look at something. And I was doing plays at that point. The first play I did like that was Beyond Caring, which is a play about cleaners and about insecurity and about friendship. And you'd have to watch people cleaning in real time for 5 minutes. And and people would walk out, and so on, because it didn't have critical validation at that point, so it was just some nonsense. As soon as the critics say it's good, you kind of lose and don't tempt fate. But that was me trying to say, really look at how can theatre for me isn't a profession, it's not a art form even, it's a technology. I don't want to use that word mistakenly, but it's a mechanism, it's an essential way of being in the world. And I remember when at certain moments in my life, I've gone to Greece, and just without any specific academic knowledge of it, I've sat in Delphi, Epidavros, and many other places. I've just sat and pondered why there is this necessity to truly see our life. And that's a lifelong journey. How can you create the conditions in which we can truly see something? And so, in a way, I call it, what I've noticed from studying the history of theatre is that every shock in theatre history comes about by fiddling with the architecture of it in some way. So a new architecture, a new way of thinking about the space, whether it's small or big, of course, the very basic examples are Brecht, the kind of immediate prominence of the proscenium, the letterbox, which you look at Ibsen or even earlier, people suddenly seeing into a private life. Peter Brook used to say that the whole of British theatre changed when the curtain went up on Back in Anger and so on was ironing. It's his famous, sort of one of his many catchphrases. And someone thought, oh wow, you can put that on stage. And so for me, my modest way when I started making theatre, I was always asking myself, what aren't we seeing? And in a way, this has guided me quite helpfully since. And so in terms of tragedy, I spoke earlier about the architecture, but I wanted it to feel like a microscope, with this very, very bright light that flips onto the audience and comes back. And so in a way, you're in a theatre not to be told a story to escape from life, because I think that our whole modernity is based on escapism. And I'm more interested in the theatre and coming back to truly see the conditions of our life. And you talk about French culture has had immense influence on me. I studied French here. I live in Paris now. And the thing that was very important for me was Racine. I've been on pilgrimages to where Racine went to school and stuff. I'm a bit sad. But I think Racine was really hardcore. And Racine did his plays in I've been to the Comédie Française where they weren't staged in the Comédie Française, they were staged in salons across the road in the Louvre, as far as I understand it, from the guy who runs the Comédie Française, so you better not be wrong. These were plays that were put on in a certain condition where people were able to suddenly see something they weren't able to see otherwise. So when I make a play, I'm really thinking, this play in particular, I'm really thinking, to come to tragedy, I'm really thinking, this guy is you read Arthur Miller, it's brilliant, in The View from the Bridge. The first scene, he's waiting, I kind of borrowed that structure. He's waiting for the disaster to come in, the ship to come in, it's so clever. The ship's coming, bringing the bad news. And in Sur Racine, which is a very important area for me, Roland Barthes speaks very eloquently about the inner chamber, the antechamber, and the sea. And so the news comes from the sea, lands, comes to the antechamber, and if it goes into the interchamber, if someone leaves the stage, they die. This is Racine Roland Barthes going a bit crazy, but I think that's true of my play. I tried to create it in three spaces. So there's the darkness beyond and the world outside. And when I worked in different contexts, I've worked in many different places around the world, and I was talking about Korea earlier. In traditional Korean theatre, there's three circles. There's the world, purgatory, and the afterlife. And it's literally where you stand. And so once you start thinking about space and time and plot all as one instrument, you are combining writing and directing already from the beginning. And in terms of dramatic structure and pure playwriting, well, I tried to make it that not one, sounds silly, but very hard, like 40 drafts, where not one line is not moving him closer to the point of having to face himself, I suppose. And so they're there waiting for someone to arrive that is going to create the outcome that we're going to watch in 1 hour and 20 minutes time. And anything that distracts from that is totally unnecessary. And by the way, the biggest trap for adaptation of Greek drama is to try and reproduce a dramatic structure that no longer makes sense to you. So that was my big thing. When I go and watch adaptations of Greek plays, 9 times out of 10, I don't believe it. And I felt the only way I could do it was to actually get inside what the core of it was to my own personal life and the life of the people around me. And I listened to the actors a lot. Emma Darcy is such a genius, they were like, they're so in the character. And I build my plays over months and months, I work with the actors, I kind of develop the characters with the actors. By the end they're we're doing 2-hour improvisations, which don't go in the play, but they're completely embodied. And so the need is so strong that all my job as a dramatist is to create the conditions in which that need can truly exist. And then, you have to intersperse it. You were very helpful, both of you. I went to see these two wonderful scholars a few months ago, and both of you said that I didn't know anything about Greek drama, and you said, well, there would be someone walking around with a stick to wake people up. So you have to keep them, and there would be amongst the tragedy, there would be comic and musical moments. So I made it certain that I would have extremely loud music in the play and put loads of jokes in it. And so this was just the approach. It was very practical. I'm a very practical person.
And actually, I was going to ask you about the music, which was extraordinary, because that I maybe wrongly implied that the art was unstoppable, and in that sense, kind of not very Greek. But you punctuated it brilliantly with this music. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit? I know you've worked with composers before. Do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, the composer was a guy called Yanis Philippakis. He's in a rock band called Foals, which hopefully some of you know. And it's quite a interesting. He's Greek as well. So the function of the music for me was, well, in a way, the whole stage is they're building these windows because they want to get the light in, but we never show the light. It's always pitch black. So they're talking about a light that will come in that never does, except when this big light above shines the other way and shows the trees for the first time. So the whole relationship of the play is what physically showing what's seen and unseen. So we talk about the trees, we never see them. The light moves, we then do see them. There's a glass through which we should see, but in fact we see darkness. And then the edge of the stage, the whole set was meant to look like a house, but also like a tomb. And so I asked Yanis, can you create the sound of basically the afterlife? That was the brief. And he did. It's very loud, and it's incredibly, he's very gifted at creating incredibly contemporary. Also, I'm interested, there's an artist today working in electronic music called Burial. Don't know if anyone knows who Burial is. If you don't, you really should, especially one of the artists, because he's the best right now, in my opinion. So he's an anonymous electronic music producer calling himself Burial, which is quite interesting, in South London. And he makes music entirely out of YouTube footage that's like repurposed, and he creates rhythms and sounds from video games. So I suppose archaeological debris of our modern world. And Yanis had a similar approach. It was sort of sounds that came from forgotten traces of life. So repurposed synths from the 70s and sort of ambient sound. I think sound is a very profoundly important thing in theatre, actually, increasingly. And the first sound that I'm interested in is silence. So my early plays, I had no music very deliberately because I was interested in really creating a thickness. And that's what I use silence very deliberately. The play begins with two people texting, and there's like a minute and a half of nothing. And what I'm trying to do there is get you to retune your expectation of what a play should be. You know, you go to a play, you normally get sort of a bit of plot in the first 10 lines, a bit of, someone comes in and yeah, that's a good structure, but try and cheat it and constantly work in the folds of it. So yeah, sound is crucial to me, and it's linked to the light. So it's all, for those who are interested in theatre, it's programmed very specifically so that the lighting and the sound worked as one. That's not so uncommon these days. But.
And I think most people, again, were truly impressed with how you use that vast space, that's the little thing, because I mean, very often that's very difficult, quite a challenge, but I think you absolutely did it brilliantly. And you say that just one other question related to the music, you said it was, the brief was to create the afterlife, but it was remarkably dissonant, and it seemed to me when it came, and often that was that was the shock too, is that it was very often a kind of a soundscape on inner turmoil. So and so I hadn't immediately thought of it as being the afterlife, but
the dead.
Well, I was going to, and in that sense, sort of maybe really relating to what you were saying before, and that is that of course everyone is trapped in this kind of liminal
between two things,
in life kind of space.
We all are.
Anyway, back to you, Laura.
I want to pick up on what you said about humour, and how you feel that works in a play that's you described at the start as a tragedy, but then you also said a minute later, but this is a comedy, and that obviously in an ancient context, then those genres are conceptualized very different. But how did you envisage the humour, which was there was some very funny farcical moments with the ashes. How does that fit in with this breaching of taboo and the awful, also very horrific and traumatic things that happen in the play?
I think humour is my taste, bluntly. I just like to laugh when I go to the theatre. I don't like, there's a Malian proverb, but I think it's Amadou Habib who said, trop sérieux, pas sérieux, which means too serious isn't really serious. And I think that's a wonderful guide for making theatre, that if you take yourself, if you know, too often I've seen tragedies or Greek tragedies I've seen where they're really tragic. And I just actually don't think, I think that for me, one of the good tragedians of our time is Paul Thomas Anderson, who writes films that have a sense of destiny and of irrepressibility that, and Lars von Trier understands this very well as well. And in both cases, the humor for me is a very specific kind of humor. It's a humor that is about being so kind of, it needs to be a little bit shocking, the humor. So it's often, you know, the character that's very funny is Terry, who says these appalling things about suicide, misogyny, violence, and that I like the audience to laugh. And because I've lit them a little bit, I like them to laugh in a way that is a little bit awkward. So when, for instance, the uncle snogs his niece, sometimes people laugh a little bit, but then the next minute they can't. And I like to create this, I'm very interested in creating incredible discomfort in the audience. I mean, I'm very deliberately trying to do that. So humor is a tool. I wouldn't say discomfort, I want the audience to be disturbed. But I often say, you know, when you fall in love with somebody, you are disturbed. You know, someone was telling me, I won't say who, but someone was telling me, one of the cast members was saying about the first time they fell in love, and they were like, it was so painful. It's a very young person. So painful. I had no idea what was going on, you know. I was really like, I was ill. I was so touched because I was like, yes, of course. But I mean, why shouldn't you feel like that when you go to the theatre? You know, I want the audience to feel ill and excited and terrified. And it seems to me that that's what, you know, Aristotle asks you to do as well. Pity, fear. And I guess my big point is, I think that if you're making theatre today, you can't rely on models. Theatre is, to give another Brooke quote, Brooke used to say, theatre is incredibly exciting and gone forever. He was asked how he wanted to be remembered, and he always said, I want to be remembered for not being remembered. And that's because he was a real man of the theatre, which is to say that something extraordinarily important that's ephemeral in theatre. And once you understand that, you know that you can't rely on models. So the study of ancient, I was talking over lunch about this professor you had here at Oxford called Alain Viala, who was a professor of French literature and literary history. And I remember going to one of his lectures where he said, why is Molière in 5 acts? It's because the smoke on the stage was such that after 20 minutes they needed to change the scene because you couldn't see him. This marriage of practicality and art is, I mean, Shakespeare, absolutely the same. You've got to finish the play. I mean, I'm not going to get all sloppy about Bob Dylan, but if you listen to Bob Dylan's Nobel lecture, you'll understand that there's a beautiful marriage of the practical and the artistic. Even Beckett was incredibly practical. It's a whole other conversation. I know someone who edited Beckett's, I'm very interested in Beckett. And I think there's something essential about that in the face. This is very rough. And humour plays a role in that. You've got to really be in your time. You've got to try and be in the moment that you're making it. You know, something happened with the King last week. Oh, it has to be like that. If there isn't that in theatre, it sort of dies. Very hard to do theatre today, but incredibly exciting.
And I'm thinking about what you've just said about humour, Laura, and you referred to the moment with Tiresias and the Ismene thing.
Yeah.
And I was with people who found Tiresias really inappropriately creepy.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure now you'd be delighted, but actually I thought it was brilliant because you realise, picking up on what you were saying before, that this is not only an oppressive space, an oppressive house, it's also one where the kind of pressure of the patriarchy is felt
let's talk about
by everyone. So
let's talk about that. That's a great provocation. Sorry.
Yeah, no, please.
I really want to get into that. I really want to remember that, yeah. So Emma Darcy is a non-binary person, right? That's just a fact about who they are as a person and as an artist. And they're, in many ways, because of their kind of public profile, they represent that. So when you go to the theatre to see Emma Darcy, like half the audience comes, not half, but hundreds of people come every night because Emma Darcy inspires them, and then they see Emma Darcy. So that's important. And they're extraordinary. The masculinity that I wanted to show was a masculinity that is the cool uncle. So the kind of the nice guy, the guy that like kind of is really down with people and like really relates. But I think that inside that there's a poison, despite everything. And then I think men need to understand masculinity. And this is a person who needs to understand. He says at one point in the play, it's one of my favorite bits. He says, they say she, Annie, because Annie's she pronouns. She says, someone has to, who's going to make? He says someone has to decide. And she goes, you can't decide. Chris says to her, and she says, why? Because you do. He goes, yeah, someone has to. And this sense of I have to fix this family. I need to restore the order after the suicide, and I know best because I actually am the one with the money. And I think there's a really nice illusion between like gender and like money and patriarchy. It sort of works. Now, I don't want to get too into that stuff because it's kind of, it can become a bit of a dead end. But what I mean is the patriarchy I was interested in showing was the patriarchy of money. So I'm very interested in money because money for me is a kind of power. It's obvious. But the money that Chris has, he's remaking the house. It's suggested that Erica and Lenny don't really have an abode. They're like kind of outsiders. Also, there's a racial difference between them and Chris, you know, and that's also there in the play. So they're living with him. He is deciding what's going to happen for everyone. There's a dynamic at play there that is it's just there. It's just in the bodies of the people. So we didn't mention it. It's not in the script, but it's just there. And Chris's power over Annie is also the power of memory. Who remembers what? And I think that intersection between like what is remembered and who gets to decide what the history is being played out across our world in a political sense. And what I was interested in doing is saying, well, we remember this attraction or strange energy between us in two different ways. I sent you to boarding school because I didn't want to get into it. And you stayed in the grief because you felt you weren't given any agency in this. And Emma is then playing somebody who is I use the term AFAB, something about a female body who's got chronic pain. All this is incidental, but is living in a situation in society where they are not diagnosed, they're not understood. And just the situation, the way that gender and patriarchy works in the play is, I never like to spell it out. I mean, I work with trans actors all the time without ever saying they're trans actors. They're just playing the gender that they are, right? And that's an example of, for me, those different understandings of what power is and those assumptions about what power is. It was too simple for Creon to just be a bully. But what's important about Tiresias is who is his friend? His friend is this disgusting guy. And why is he always hanging around? Because he's attracted to that energy. He knows that everything's possible in this house. The sort of smelly energy. And he knows he can get away with it. And he knows he can drink all the posh wine and he can like, you know, he doesn't want to leave. And I just think that it's important to show without telling how power works. Because we all sort of feel it, but no one really says it. But I do. I try to. We do, it's collective.
Before we go, a very big thank you to Fiona, Laura, and Carol.